All right, we're here. Twitch.tv/110sports, 110sportsmedia.com/live where you're watching on Twitch, the website, Periscope. Thank you so much for being a part of this Wednesday morning edition of 110 Daily. Chris Brown is here with me. Chris, how you doing?
Doing pretty good, Josh. Can't complain. We made it to December, final month of 2020. We're in the second day now, so we're starting to move along. We're making progress in the month. I'm feeling pretty good, even though wasn't particularly inspired by the sports I watched last night. That's okay though. There's still takeaways. We'll still sort through it.
Yeah, it's a weird. COVID either made it an incredibly long year, or it feels like this year absolutely went just flying by, because nothing really there was no, other than it being COVID, nothing super memorable happened. Like, we graduated from college, but we didn't have a ceremony, so there wasn't really there's not a whole lot to look back on throughout the year other than just sort of being in quarantine. So it sort of makes the year feel like it just flew by, but at the same time, this has been a really long year for a lot of people, and it's been a stressful year. And so it's a weird balance between the two, because sometimes like, this year flew by, but then I try to look back on it, it's like, wow, spring break feels like it was forever ago.
Yeah, that's a good point. It does feel kind of like a little of both, where like it's been such a strange year where we didn't really know what was going to happen next in like the world, in a lot of our lives and whatnot. And so in some ways it was really long, but then like you said, at the same time, the lack of I don't look back to personally a lot of, huge events of like, this is what I did on this date, these big things. So I look back and I'm like, well, it's been kind of an empty year in terms of big, exciting events for me personally. So in that case, yeah, it feels like, I go back and forth. It feels like a little bit of both, depending which angle you look at it.
Regardless, there's sports here. There were sports last night, and like you said, there were relatively uninspiring sports. Before we jump into the Champions Classic, let me just briefly touch on what we're going to talk about on the show today. We're going to start with the Champions Classic last night, and then we're going to sort of parlay that, use that momentum to talk about the five best teams in college basketball right now. We're now a week into the season, and the top five doesn't look like what the top five looked at when the preseason AP poll came out. We'll start at the top of the second segment with the Ravens and the Steelers, some COVID-19 talk. It's now been almost a full week since that game was supposed to be played, and we're just now this afternoon going to get that game. NBA training camp started yesterday, December 1st, so we're going to talk the rookie that we're most excited to see, and some big storylines from each conference. Finish it up with a challenge flag and what are you watching today, and get out of here on a Wednesday. But Chris, I want to start with the Champions Classic. Let's just start with the scores. You had Duke, Michigan State to start the evening in Cameron Indoor, 75-69 win for the Spartans. Tom Izzo's first ever win. Tom Izzo's done a lot of things in the sport of college basketball. Until last night, he had not won in Cameron Indoor. Now, there's part of me that wants to not count that win in Cameron Indoor, because you really went and won in an empty gym that really wasn't any different from the YMCA gym last night, right? It echoed. There was, all you could hear was the talking on the floor. It's not really a win at Cameron Indoor in the sense that you have to deal with the Cameron Crazies, but nonetheless, Tom Izzo and Michigan State getting it done at Duke last night. What were your biggest takeaways from this game? What, apart from the fact that nobody can make a shot and it was just relatively uninspiring for most of that game?
Yeah, for me, I feel like, and this is, I not that I'm giving myself too much credit for this, but I think it kind of played out a little bit in terms of the rationale for the way this game turned out being what I kind of thought it might be, and what Josh and I talked about yesterday, in that Michigan State just looked like the tougher team. They were calmer. They looked more experienced because they were more experienced.
Right.
And Duke looked inexperienced. They looked flustered. And that's because, well, they were much less experienced. I think we learned that this Duke team has a long way to go. That's not to say that they won't get there at all. Like, that's not a problem. That's not, anything long term that I'm panicking about.
Mm-hmm.
But they looked flustered when Michigan State didn't collapse in the early minutes. And, you talked about it. You discussed how, messy of a game this was. Duke started rushing shots. They started trying to force things offensively, and they weren't paying enough attention defensively. So they've got some learning to do. That includes Jalen Johnson. He
Mm-hmm.
had a great game against Coppin State, but he clearly just has some growing to do, which is fine. He's a freshman. For Michigan State, really good defensive team. Obviously, a lot of Duke struggles were from their inexperience, but you have to give the Spartans some credit.
Mm-hmm.
And I was also really impressed with Aaron Henry. It's also a Spartans team that has some work to do offensively. They weren't especially efficient, but overall, I think for me, my bigger takeaway is just the experience gap and how much that really means in these early games between these two teams.
I honestly think that's the biggest overarching takeaway for me from the Champions Classic, from this game, and from Kansas and Kentucky, which we'll get to more specifically in a second here. But the two teams that have the more years of experience in college basketball were the two teams that won. And these were two relatively close games. Now, this Duke-Michigan State game was not as close as the 6-point finals, the 6-point deficit in the final score, but it was clear that Michigan State was the better. I was expecting that to be the case. Duke made Coppin State look way better than Coppin State actually is. Michigan State, while allowing Notre Dame to slip in, the spread for that Notre Dame Michigan State game was 10, and they were up by 17 the entire game, and then it dropped down to 10. But it was not a close game. They controlled that game. They're the deeper team. They're the more experienced team. I mean, Malik Hall, Foster Loyer, Julius Marble II were all great off the bench, especially Hall and Marble. Led by Rocket Watts, Aaron Henry had 14, Joey Hauser had 11. This was the third leading scorer for the Spartans in the 3 games. So they've had 3 different leading scorers each of their first 3 games, which speaks to their depth, but also speaks to how this team isn't going to operate like it did last year with Cassius Winston and Xavier Tillman. Winston was arguably the best point guard in the country, and definitely one of the best playmakers in the country, both for himself and for his team. And as a result, very rarely did Michigan State have just a horrible offensive possession, even if it meant that you didn't get the shots you were looking for, and at the end of the shot clock, it's a Cassius Winston isolation or Cassius Winston, Xavier Tillman pick and roll. And even if that's a contested jumper, I'll take Xavier Tillman, Cassius and Xavier in the pick and roll on any offensive possession. I was impressed by Rocket Watts. I wish Aaron Henry would be better than I think he should be. Like, he's the guy that I keep expecting to take a bigger step. And he hasn't super done that yet, but they did enough to get it done, which was the important part here. The Duke side of things, I need Jeremy Roach and DJ Stewart to be better just in general. Jeremy Roach and DJ Stewart, the freshman guards for Duke. Roach has been relatively non-existent. The two of them in this game combined for 12 points on 2 of 11 shooting, 4 assists and 4 turnovers. And when you put those two guys in the starting lineup and make that change from Jordan Goldwire and bring Goldwire off the bench, you need them to be better. And that's where, right, they're freshmen. This is game 2, and Michigan State is not Coppin State, right? But you need them to get better as the season goes along, because if they don't have better guard play in the ACC, they're going to struggle. And like you said with Johnson, is he anywhere close to the 19-19 guy he was against Coppin State, or is he more the 11-4 guy he was last night? Because that's another big part of Duke's ceiling and Duke's success this season is how good he is in general. But there were times where I didn't know who I would give the ball to if I needed a bucket from Duke. I just didn't. And Matthew Hurt was great. He had 21 in this game, went to the free throw line a bunch. I really like his offensive game, and I just like him as a player a lot. But he's not a shot creator. He's a put him in the right positions and he'll make the best of it kind of player. But I wasn't surprised by this outcome. But I definitely left feeling less confident about Duke in general than I did prior to the game actually beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was one of my big takeaways with Duke too, is who's going to be that shot creator. There's a lot of candidates, but there's, through a
Yeah.
couple games now, I'm not sure that I have any confidence one way or another who that's going to be. I mean, there's some guys that I think, okay, if they click, if they get it figured out, they could absolutely be them, but I don't really have a great deal of I'm not feeling more confident that we're getting closer to figuring that out right
Mm.
now. And as for Michigan State, yeah, I was impressed. Also, you mentioned the three leading scores in three different games for them. That was certainly impressive. They had five players finish in double figures last night. You mentioned all of them, I believe. And I think obviously, this is a team that is not, they're not firing on all cylinders by any regard, but they have the foundation that I think is as good as you can expect. Right? They have the foundation of
Mm.
defense and toughness, and I think it's great. That's a great place to start to work up from there. Obviously, it wasn't a pretty situation for them. Especially in the first half of that game, they committed some silly errors in the final minutes to make it closer than it should have been.
Yeah.
There's clearly work to do there too, but I like the foundation of where Michigan State is at right now, just in terms of the things that you kind of know you're going to get from them, and then you can work up from there. Duke has a lot more question marks throughout that just simply have to be answered. You have to have an answer sooner than later on them.
Right. I think in a weird way. Now, Michigan State's floor is much higher than Duke's floor, but
Right.
I think Duke might have a higher ceiling. They're super athletic. They're going to be a good defensive team. They're gonna look like. I thought they looked pretty similar to Kentucky actually, and Kentucky is super
Yeah.
long and super athletic, but Duke. Seeing Jeremy Roach on Kentucky would also make sense. And if it's going to be a team like Kentucky this year that if their freshmen figure it out, their ceiling and their potential is really high. If Jalen Johnson becomes a go-to scorer that they need, if Jeremy Roach and DJ Stewart can be that backcourt combo that they have the potential to be, and then you have Matthew Hurt, you have Jordan Goldwire, you have some of those other pieces and more particularly some returning pieces. Wendell Moore Jr. as well, who was also really bad in this one. He was 0 of 9 from the floor for just 4 points. The talent is certainly there, but unlike a Duke team, and unlike most Duke teams, they're not hanging their hat completely on performances of freshmen. That 2015 team, you had Quinn Cook, and even though Tyus Jones and Jahlil Okafor were the guys for that team, along with Justice Winslow, you had Quinn Cook. Last year, you had Trey Jones, and this year you just don't have those veterans that impact the game the same way that Trey Jones did in particular last season. But they could be the ceiling is high. It's just a matter of whether or not they get there. Speaking of Kentucky, Kansas in Indianapolis. Kansas 65-62 win. This was a talk about an uninspiring basketball game. You had one team shoot 36% from the field. You had another team shoot 29% from the field. And the team that shot 29% from the field was the team that actually won this game. I was pretty impressed by Kentucky just from the sense that they bounced back from their loss against Richmond really well. I thought they fought. They really bothered Kansas with their length. Pretty much all game. That's a direct result of the 29% from the field. Isaiah Jackson is going to be an elite defender in college basketball, and with his length, 8 blocks, 12 rebounds in his third game as a college basketball player, he was all over the place. I was impressed by their bounce back because this is a young team, and most young Calipari teams take a little while to figure it out. And I like Kansas. They've got. I feel like they've got go-to scorers. I feel like they've got experience. Jalen Wilson exploded onto the national stage last night. I I was impressed by Kentucky, not by the performance necessarily, but by their bounce back and going up against a team like Kansas and making it as tough for them as they did. 65-62. What was your biggest takeaway from the nightcap in Indy?
Yeah, I had that kind of what you just said there is one of my points for Kentucky. I had positive and I had negative. And the positive was their athleticism and their length, like you talked about, could allow them to be a really good defensive team for a pretty top tier defensive team if it works out. Of course, they held Kansas to just under 30% from the field, and as you mentioned, and I thought it was interesting. I saw the stat: Kansas, the first college basketball team in the last quarter century to shoot under 30% from the floor against a top 25 team with no field goals from their bench and still win. So that shows you a little bit about what Kentucky held Kansas to, and also just what Kansas did. And I was impressed by them, like you mentioned, as well. As far as the negatives for Kentucky first, though, look, it's still an offense that's pretty darn lost right now. It's an offense that I'm not sure what their decision making doesn't seem very clear right now. In their 2 straight losses now, they're 3 of 31 from beyond the arc, and with 37 turnovers. So they need to figure out what they're doing. They need to play together. They don't look like they're playing together offensively. Like they know what they're doing, frankly, offensively, what the system is, how to execute it. If there is a system that's clear, they don't know how to execute it. But they absolutely can figure it out. I like the length of, like we talked about, allows them to be a really good defensive team, to do the kind of thing that they did against Kansas. And for Kansas, yeah, it wasn't pretty, but like you, I was impressed that, look, I think that if this Kansas team is going to be very good this year, there are going to be some ugly wins. Like that's going to happen. But let me try that again. What is there is the grit. The team out-rebounded Kentucky. Kansas out-rebounded that Kentucky team 47-43, despite playing not with a real center at some points of that game. Of course, I was impressed by Jalen Wilson as well. He had 21 of his 23 points in the second half. And so that was impressive. But yeah, I was impressed by it. Sort of, again, it goes back to that idea of experience and that idea of the toughness and the grit and the willingness to, really fight it out that Kansas had, much like we saw from Michigan State. Obviously the upside for Kentucky is high. I think it's very clear what their biggest concern is right now, what they need to figure out what their plan is offensively, how they're going to execute that better. But there's clearly some positives. You mentioned, a bounce back to some, not a complete disaster after what happened against Richmond. There's a lot to like, a lot of potential with this Kentucky team. I think there's no doubting that at all.
Yeah, it's a Kentucky team that's going to need time. It's a Kentucky team that has freshmen that aren't performing the way that they need to, for a team that's going to lean on them as much as they're going to have to. I also learned that they need to play their veteran guys more off the bench. Davion Mintz, the grad transfer from Creighton. Jacob Toppin, of course, former Dayton star Obi Toppin's brother, transfer, and he was great. He only played 12 minutes, but he had 6 points, 3 boards, was 2 of 4 from the field, and he came in the middle of the second half and was really a spark for Calipari's team. Davion Mintz was, 4 of 11, not super efficient, but BJ Boston and him led Kentucky with 12 points each. It's just a team that they're going to have to shoot the ball better. They're going to have to learn how to share the ball better. They had 0 assists against Richmond in the second half, and they weren't much better in the second half in this one. They're a team that's going to – a couple things. They're going to need to continue to get better. Every really young Calipari team looks like this early on in the season, which is fine because they always seem to figure it out, at least to a certain extent, by the time March comes around. And they need to, I don't know, figure out how to adjust to the other team adjusting at halftime. They just they're just a different team in the second half. And maybe that's youth, maybe that's just teams making adjustments, whatever it might be. I was Right. If Kansas knocks down a couple more shots, this game isn't particularly close. I mean, Christian Brown, who had 30 points and 6 3-pointers in Kansas's last game, was 2 of 10 from the field, had 13 rebounds, which is awesome, but was just 2 of 10 from the field, 0 of 4 from the 3-point line, and at least 3 of those were pretty wide open, if not all 4 of them. Jalen Wilson, 23 points, 10 rebounds. He looks like he's going to be the breakout star of this Kansas team. I hope that their depth gets better in terms of production, whether it's Bryce Thompson, the 5-star recruit, or Tyon Grant Foster, the JUCO or Division II, I can't remember off the top of my head, transfer coming in, Mitch Lightfoot. They need some better production off the bench. I know they weren't super healthy, which is the other part of this, and not too concerned about Kansas, but these were the outcomes that I was expecting. I didn't think Kansas would struggle quite as much as they did, but if you find a way to win a basketball game when you shoot 29% from the field, then you're going to be okay, because you're probably not going to shoot that poorly again this season. Coming up next, we're going to snowball this into our top 5 college basketball teams a week into the season. I don't know about you, but mine, at least the order of mine, looks different from the current AP Top 25 poll. But we'll do that next. You're watching One Ten Daily on the One Ten Sports Network.